I was a secretary who lost files, according to the termination letter sliding across Richard Hartwell's mahogany desk toward my trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with injustice and sealed with corporate letterhead that might as well have been a death warrant for my career. His fingers drummed against the desk's surface as I read, each tap a methodical countdown to my professional execution. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, carving out the smugness that had been building there for weeks. He'd been waiting for this moment, savoring it like aged wine. The accusations were precise, clinical: missing contracts, misplaced financial records, a pattern of negligence that painted me as incompetent at best, saboteur at worst. Each bullet point on the termination notice felt like a nail hammered into my coffin, except I knew the truth. I hadn't lost those files. I'd been too careful, too meticulous in my organization to make such errors. But Richard's eyes told a different story. They held the cold satisfaction of a man who'd orchestrated something beautiful, something that would rid him of an inconvenient witness. Because that's what I'd become in recent months, an inconvenience. Someone who asked too many questions about his late-night meetings, his sudden wealth, his mysterious overseas calls. The termination meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Richard's assistant, Janet, sat in the corner taking notes, her pen scratching against paper like claws on stone. She avoided my eyes, probably ashamed of her complicity in this theatrical performance. Security waited outside the conference room, their presence a not-so-subtle reminder that I was now considered a threat to company assets. I signed the acknowledgement forms with hands that refused to shake. Every signature was a small victory against Richard's expectation of my collapse. He wanted tears, pleading, perhaps even anger that would justify his decision to the board. Instead, I gave him nothing but professional courtesy and the kind of smile that made his jaw tighten imperceptibly. The walk to my desk felt like a funeral procession. 23 months of employment reduced to 15 minutes of supervised packing. My colleagues watched from their cubicles, some with genuine sympathy, others with the guilty relief of survivors. They'd all heard the whispers about my alleged incompetence, carefully planted seeds that had taken root in the office ecosystem. But as I cleared out my desk drawers, muscle memory guided my hands to the small recording device I'd hidden beneath the false bottom of my pencil holder. 3 months of clandestine documentation, triggered by suspicions that had been growing like cancer in my gut. Richard thought he'd silenced the only person who might expose his secret, but he'd merely created his own executioner. The device was smaller than a matchbox, nearly invisible among the office supplies I'd accumulated over 2 years. Its memory held fragments of conversations, phone calls, and admissions that would have made Richard's blood run cold if he'd known. But he'd been too arrogant, too confident in his ability to manipulate and control. My cardboard box felt light as I carried it through the lobby for the last time. The security guard, Marcus, had the decency to look uncomfortable as he escorted me to the parking garage. He'd always been kind to me, sometimes sharing stories about his daughter's softball games while we waited for the elevator. Now he was reduced to a prop in Richard's performance, forced to treat me like a criminal. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and horn honks, but my mind was already 3 steps ahead. Richard had made his first mistake by underestimating me. His second mistake was believing that my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. His third mistake, the fatal one, was thinking that firing me would make his problems disappear. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door. The same furniture, the same walls, but everything had shifted. I was no longer Sarah the secretary. I was Sarah the hunter, and Richard Hartwell had just painted a target on his own back. The recording device sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb. I'd been careful to activate it only during Richard's most unguarded moments, late afternoons when he thought the office was empty, hushed phone conversations he believed were private, meetings with visitors who never appeared on the official schedule. The first recording was from 6 weeks ago. Richard's voice, slightly muffled but unmistakable, discussing contract modifications with someone named Victor. The conversation was coded, but the meaning was clear to anyone willing to listen carefully. Client information was being passed along, competitive bids were being shared, and Richard was being compensated handsomely for his betrayal. I'd stumbled upon his operation by accident. A misfiled document had led me to a folder that shouldn't have existed, containing copies of contracts that had been modified after our legal department's review. The changes were subtle, delivery dates shifted, payment terms altered, specifications adjusted in ways that would benefit competitors who somehow knew exactly how to underbid our proposals. For 3 months, I'd documented everything. Late nights when Richard thought he was alone in his office, having video conferences with contacts he'd never mentioned to anyone, encrypted emails that he'd print and immediately shred, not knowing that I'd learned to read upside down from years of taking dictation, bank deposit slips that found their way into his personal briefcase, amounts that far exceeded his executive salary. The irony was beautiful. Richard had fired me for losing files, but I'd actually been finding them. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered was carefully cataloged, cross-referenced, and stored in multiple locations. While he'd been selling company secrets, I'd been building a case that would destroy him. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister asking about dinner plans, normal life intruding on my transformation. I ignored it. Normal life could wait. Richard had forced me into this game, and I intended to play it better than he ever imagined possible. The laptop screen glowed as I began typing. My resignation letter to the board of directors, the one they'd never see coming. Not a complaint or a plea for reinstatement, but a detailed report with supporting documentation that would make Richard's corporate sins impossible to ignore. Every allegation would be supported by evidence, every claim backed by recorded proof. But that was just the opening move. Richard's real punishment wouldn't come from corporate justice or legal consequences. It would come from the same systematic destruction he'd inflicted on me, except I had advantages he'd never possessed. I knew his patterns, his weaknesses, his secrets. More importantly, I knew how to be patient. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after a storm. I woke up refreshed, energized by purpose in a way that months of office drudgery had never provided. My coffee tasted better, the morning news seemed less depressing, and the face in my bathroom mirror looked like it belonged to someone who'd finally found their calling. I had work to do. My first stop was the office supply store, not for the obvious items, recording equipment, surveillance tools, or anything that might leave a digital trail. Instead, I bought stationery, manila folders, and a new briefcase. The kind of mundane supplies that would make me invisible in corporate settings, just another administrative professional going about her business. The coffee shop across from my former office became my new headquarters. From the window table, I could observe the comings and goings of Hartwell Industries without being seen. The barista, a college student named Emma, began recognizing my order by the second day. Medium coffee, black, with a blueberry muffin that I rarely touched. Food had become secondary to the hunt. Richard's routine was as predictable as sunrise. He arrived at 8:47 each morning, parking his silver BMW in the executive spot that had been freshly painted with his name. His stride was confident, almost cocky, as he nodded to the security guard and disappeared into the elevator. A man without a care in the world, completely unaware that his former secretary was cataloging his every move. The breakthrough came on day 4 of my surveillance. Richard emerged from the building at 11:30 a.m., unusual for someone who rarely left the office before evening. He walked 3 blocks to the Meridian Hotel, constantly checking his phone and glancing over his shoulder, the behavior of a man conducting business he didn't want discovered. I followed at a distance, using reflective surfaces and crowd cover to stay invisible. The hotel lobby was busy enough to provide camouflage, full of business travelers and tourists who wouldn't notice one more woman in professional attire. Richard took the elevator to the 7th floor, and I waited exactly 4 minutes before following. The hallway was empty except for a housekeeping cart near room 712. The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up as I approached. I smiled and gestured toward the cart, pointing to my wrist as if asking the time. She checked her watch and held up her fingers. 11:45. I nodded gratefully and continued down the hall, noting that room 718 had a Do Not Disturb sign hanging from the door handle. Through the thin walls, I could hear muffled voices. Richard's baritone mixed with an accent I couldn't place, possibly Eastern European. The conversation was too quiet to make out words, but the rhythm suggested negotiation, perhaps payment for services rendered. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, risking discovery for the chance to gather intelligence. A door opened somewhere down the hall. I immediately straightened and began walking toward the elevator, pulling out my phone as if I'd received an important call. The performance was unnecessary. It was just another hotel guest, but maintaining cover had become second nature. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. Richard's meeting could last 5 minutes or 5 hours, and I needed to be in position when he emerged. The hotel bar provided the perfect vantage point, offering clear sightlines to both the elevator and the main entrance, while allowing me to blend in with the lunch crowd. I ordered a club sandwich and positioned myself at a corner table, my back to the wall and my eyes on the elevator doors. The briefcase beside my chair contained a small camera, designed to look like a phone charger but capable of recording video from 20 feet away. If Richard appeared with his contact, I'd have visual proof of their meeting. The wait stretched on. My untouched sandwich grew cold while I sipped water and pretended to read emails on my phone. Other hotel guests came and went, business people conducting their own private meetings, tourists planning their afternoon activities, normal people living normal lives, unaware that industrial espionage was being conducted just floors above their heads. At 1:15 p.m. the elevator chimed. Richard stepped out alone, his expression satisfied in a way that made my stomach turn. He'd just concluded another transaction, probably selling more of his company's secrets to the highest bidder. But this time I'd been watching. He walked through the lobby with the confidence of a man who'd never been caught, never been questioned, never been held accountable for his betrayals. His phone buzzed, and he answered it with a smile that suggested good news. Everything was going according to his plan, except it wasn't. Not anymore. I waited until he'd cleared the hotel entrance before following. The recording device in my purse had captured audio from the lobby, potentially including his phone conversation. Even if the quality was poor, voice recognition software could identify participants and provide transcripts. Technology had become my equalizer in this war of information. The walk back to my coffee shop surveillance post gave me time to process what I'd witnessed. Richard's operation was more sophisticated than I'd initially believed. The hotel meetings, the overseas contacts, the systematic theft of corporate intelligence, this wasn't opportunistic crime, but organized betrayal. He'd been selling his company's future to competitors, probably for months or even years. But sophistication created vulnerabilities. The more complex his operation became, the more evidence he'd leave behind. Every meeting, every phone call, every transaction was a potential thread I could pull to unravel his entire network. He thought he was untouchable, but he'd actually built his own prison. The coffee shop felt like a command center when I returned. My laptop, notebooks, and surveillance equipment spread across the table like a general's war maps. Emma brought my usual order without being asked, probably recognizing the intense concentration that had become my default expression. I began transcribing the audio I'd captured, using headphones to isolate voices and software to enhance quality. Richard's phone conversation was partially audible, enough to confirm he was discussing financial transfers and delivery schedules. The accent I'd heard in the hotel room belonged to someone named Victor, the same name from my earlier recordings. A pattern was emerging. Richard met with Victor monthly, always at the Meridian Hotel, always in different rooms. The meetings coincided with major contract negotiations at Hartwell Industries, suggesting a direct connection between the company's business activities and Richard's side operation. He was selling real-time intelligence to competitors, giving them unfair advantages in bidding processes. The scope of his betrayal was staggering. 3 years of winning contracts, lost to companies that somehow knew exactly how to undercut our proposals. Dozens of employees laid off because of declining revenues, their livelihoods sacrificed to Richard's greed. The corporate culture of suspicion and cost-cutting, all traceable to his systematic sabotage. But the most personal betrayal was my termination. Richard had fired me not because I'd lost files, but because I'd found them. My questions about his activities, my careful attention to document management, my growing suspicion about his unexplained wealth, all of it had made me a liability. So he'd eliminated me using the very accusations that proved his guilt. The recording device revealed more than just Richard's crimes. It exposed his methods, his contacts, his weaknesses. He was arrogant, careless about security when he thought he was among allies. He treated his co-conspirators with the same condescension he'd shown me, creating resentment that could be exploited. Most importantly, he'd grown comfortable with his success, dropping his guard in ways that would prove fatal. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet, Richard's assistant. Her message was brief but loaded with subtext. Heard about what happened. Sorry. Coffee sometime? The invitation could be genuine sympathy or something more complex. Janet had been in the room during my termination, had seen Richard's performance, had access to information that could prove invaluable. I typed back, "Tomorrow 2 p.m., Cafe Luna on 5th Street. A neutral location, public enough to be safe but quiet enough for private conversation." If Janet was feeling guilty about her role in my termination, she might be willing to share intelligence about Richard's activities. If not, I'd at least learn more about office dynamics in my absence. The afternoon passed in a blur of documentation and analysis. I created timelines, connecting Richard's hotel meetings to major contract losses, his overseas calls to competitor announcements, his sudden wealth to company revenue declines. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, a web of coincidences that could only be explained by systematic betrayal. But evidence without a delivery mechanism was useless. I needed to choose my moment carefully, ensuring maximum impact while minimizing Richard's ability to cover his tracks. The board of directors would be my target audience, specifically the chairman, Elizabeth Morrison. She'd built her reputation on corporate integrity and had zero tolerance for ethical violations. My laptop screen reflected my face as I worked, and I barely recognized the person staring back. The quiet secretary who'd once taken dictation and filed reports had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, more dangerous. Richard had created his own nemesis, and I was just getting started. The evening brought new intelligence. Richard's credit card records, obtained through methods that would never hold up in court, but provided valuable insights into his operation. Regular payments to offshore accounts, cash advances that coincided with his hotel meetings, restaurant bills for meals with contacts who didn't exist in the company directory. Each piece of evidence was another nail in his coffin, but I needed something more dramatic for my revenge. Richard had destroyed my career with public humiliation, had turned my colleagues against me with carefully planted rumors, had made me question my own competence. His punishment needed to match the crime. The idea came to me at 3 a.m., fully formed and beautiful in its simplicity. Richard's quarterly presentation to the board was scheduled for the following week. He'd be standing before the company's leadership, discussing revenue projections and market opportunities, completely unaware that his former secretary had prepared a counter-presentation that would end his career. But timing was crucial. I needed to wait until the perfect moment, when Richard was most vulnerable and his audience was most receptive. The board meeting would provide that opportunity, a captive audience of decision-makers who could act immediately on new information. My coffee shop surveillance resumed at dawn. Richard arrived at his usual time, his confident stride unchanged by whatever guilt he might feel about my termination. He nodded to the security guard, checked his phone, and disappeared into the elevator. A man living his best life, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. The day passed slowly. I monitored Richard's movements, documented his phone calls, and finalized my presentation materials. Every page was carefully crafted to maximize impact, every accusation supported by irrefutable evidence. The board would have no choice but to act, and Richard would have no defense against the systematic destruction of his reputation. Janet arrived at Cafe Luna exactly on time, her nervousness evident in the way she clutched her purse and scanned the room before approaching my table. She looked older than I remembered, stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during my employment. Working for Richard was apparently taking its toll on more than just his direct victims. Her coffee order was complicated: vanilla latte with extra foam, half calf, with a shot of sugar-free hazelnut syrup. High maintenance in a way that suggested someone trying to control small details because larger ones had spun beyond her influence. She sat across from me with the careful posture of someone expecting confrontation, but I kept my expression neutral, even friendly. Janet might be my enemy or my ally, but either way, she was a source of information. Her guilt about my termination was written across her face, and guilt could be leveraged into cooperation. She began speaking before I could, words tumbling out in a rush of nervous energy. Apologies for her role in my termination, assurances that she'd argued against Richard's decision, explanations about company policy that had forced her compliance. All of it was probably true, but it wasn't why I'd asked her to meet. I let her finish, then leaned forward slightly. My voice was calm, almost conversational. "How long have you known about Richard's side business?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Her coffee cup rattled against the saucer, her face went pale, and her carefully constructed composure crumbled. She looked around the cafe as if Richard might be lurking behind the pastry display, then back at me with eyes wide with panic. Her denial was immediate but unconvincing. She knew nothing about any side business, had no idea what I was talking about, couldn't understand why I'd make such accusations. But her body language told a different story. The way she avoided eye contact, the nervous fidgeting with her jewelry, the slight tremor in her voice, all signs of someone who knew exactly what I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and played a brief audio clip. Richard's voice, slightly distorted but unmistakable, discussing contract modifications with his contact Victor. Janet's face went ashen as she recognized not just the voice but the content of the conversation. She'd been part of this operation, whether willingly or through coercion. The confession came slowly, in fragments punctuated by tears and justifications. Richard had been selling company secrets for at least 2 years, using his position as senior vice president to access confidential information. Janet had been forced to help, managing his calendar to accommodate secret meetings, handling phone calls from mysterious contacts, preparing documents that were never filed with the company. But the most damaging revelation was yet to come. Richard had been planning to promote me to senior administrative assistant, a position that would have given me access to even more sensitive information. My termination wasn't just about silencing a potential witness, it was about preventing me from discovering the full scope of his operation. Janet's cooperation was motivated by fear rather than righteousness. Richard had threatened her job, her reputation, her future in the industry. She'd been trapped in his web just as surely as I had been, forced to choose between complicity and unemployment. But her fear could be redirected, channeled into helping me expose the truth. The information she provided was devastating. Names of contacts, dates of meetings, details about offshore accounts and payment schedules. Richard's operation was more extensive than I'd imagined, involving multiple competitors and millions in stolen intelligence. He'd been bleeding the company dry while enriching himself, a corporate vampire feeding on the organization that had trusted him. But Janet's most valuable contribution was strategic intelligence. She knew Richard's schedule, his security protocols, his weaknesses. The quarterly board presentation was his highest priority, a chance to demonstrate his value to the organization while concealing his crimes. He'd been preparing for weeks, crafting a narrative of success that would secure his position for years to come. The irony was perfect. Richard's moment of triumph would become his execution. In front of the board, with nowhere to run and no time to prepare a defense, he'd face the accumulated evidence of his betrayal. His reputation, his career, his freedom, all of it would crumble in the span of a single presentation. Janet left the cafe looking like she'd aged 5 years in an hour. Our conversation had shattered her remaining illusions about Richard's operation, forced her to confront her own complicity, and drawn her into a conspiracy that could destroy them both. But she'd also been given a chance at redemption, an opportunity to help expose the truth and reclaim her integrity. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. I refined my presentation, gathering additional evidence, preparing for every possible objection or defense Richard might attempt. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, giving me 72 hours to finalize my case against him. The hotel surveillance continued, but with new purpose. I wasn't just documenting Richard's activities, I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His confidence remained unshaken, his routine unchanged, his arrogance as pronounced as ever. He had no idea that his former secretary was methodically dismantling his life. Wednesday evening brought the final piece of intelligence I needed. Richard's phone conversation with Victor, recorded from the hotel lobby, contained explicit details about their next transaction. A major defense contract was being negotiated, worth over $50 million to Hartwell Industries. Richard was planning to sell the bidding information to a competitor, ensuring that his company would lose the contract while he collected a 7-figure commission. The timing was perfect. The board meeting would occur just hours before the contract deadline, giving Richard no opportunity to warn his co-conspirators or cover his tracks. His betrayal would be exposed at the moment of maximum damage, when the board could see the direct connection between his crimes and the company's losses. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that signals a turning point. I dressed carefully, choosing a conservative business suit that would command respect without drawing attention. My briefcase contained copies of every document, every recording, every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past 4 months. Richard's destruction would be thorough and irreversible. The Hartwell Industries building looked different as I approached. No longer the scene of my humiliation, it had become the stage for my revenge. The security guard, Marcus, looked surprised to see me but maintained his professional demeanor. He probably assumed I was there for an exit interview or to retrieve forgotten belongings. But I walked past the elevators toward the executive conference room, my visitor's badge authorizing access to areas that had once been forbidden. The board meeting was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, giving me time to prepare my presentation and steel myself for the confrontation ahead. The conference room was empty except for the long mahogany table and leather chairs that had witnessed countless corporate decisions. Soon, it would witness Richard's professional execution. I connected my laptop to the projection system, tested the audio equipment, and arranged my evidence in order of maximum impact. Board members began arriving at 9:45 a.m., their conversations casual but focused on quarterly results and strategic planning. Elizabeth Morrison, the chairman, nodded politely as she took her seat at the head of the table. She had no idea that her meeting agenda was about to be revolutionized by information that would reshape her understanding of the company's recent struggles. Richard entered at 9:58 a.m., his presentation materials organized and his confidence radiating across the room. He took his position at the front of the conference table, his smile suggesting a man who expected nothing but praise and approval. His quarterly report was undoubtedly filled with optimistic projections and strategic recommendations, none of which acknowledged his role in the company's declining fortunes. The meeting began with standard protocol. Morrison called for order, reviewed the agenda, and invited Richard to begin his presentation. He stood with the poise of a man who'd never been challenged, never been questioned, never been held accountable for his actions. His opening remarks were confident and smooth, designed to establish his credibility before delivering his carefully crafted message. I waited until he'd completed his introduction, until the board was fully engaged with his presentation, until the moment when interruption would have maximum impact. Then I stood, my voice cutting through his monologue like a blade through silk. "Madam Chairman, I have urgent information that directly contradicts Mr. Hartwell's report." The room fell silent. Richard's face went pale, then flushed with anger as he recognized my voice. Board members turned in their seats, confused by the interruption but intrigued by the possibility of new information. Morrison's expression was stern but curious, her business instincts recognizing the potential significance of my intervention. Richard's attempt to regain control was immediate but ineffective. He gestured toward the door, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, as he suggested I was a disgruntled former employee with no business in the meeting. But his protests only highlighted the guilt written across his features, the panic that had replaced his earlier confidence. Morrison's response was decisive. She indicated that I should continue, her tone suggesting that she'd already begun connecting dots that Richard had hoped would remain hidden. The board meeting had become a tribunal, and Richard was about to face judgment for his crimes. I approached the projection screen, my presentation materials ready to expose every detail of Richard's operation. The first slide displayed his photograph alongside images of the Meridian Hotel, Victor's contact information, and a timeline of secret meetings. The visual impact was immediate and devastating. For the past 6 months, Mr. Hartwell has been systematically selling company secrets to competitors. I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The evidence I'm about to present demonstrates a pattern of betrayal that has cost this company millions in lost contracts and compromised strategic advantage. Richard's objections grew more desperate as each slide revealed new evidence. Bank records showing unexplained deposits, audio recordings of his conversations with Victor, documentation of contract modifications that had never been authorized by legal counsel. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they realized the scope of his betrayal. But the most damaging evidence was yet to come. I displayed a transcript of Richard's most recent conversation with Victor, recorded just 3 days earlier. The discussion covered the defense contract that was currently being negotiated, with Richard promising to deliver confidential bidding information in exchange for a $2 million payment. The room erupted in shocked whispers and angry murmurs. Morrison's face had gone rigid with fury, her reputation for integrity challenged by the betrayal of someone she'd trusted. Other board members demanded explanations, their questions directed at Richard, but answered by the overwhelming evidence I'd presented. Richard's defense was pathetic and contradictory. He denied involvement, questioned the authenticity of evidence, and attempted to shift blame to subordinates who'd supposedly acted without his knowledge. But every word he spoke only reinforced his guilt, his desperation evident to everyone in the room. I played the final recording, the audio crystal clear despite being captured through hotel walls. Richard's voice, unmistakable and undenied, discussing payment schedules and delivery methods with Victor. The conversation ended with Richard's promise to provide the defense contract information within 24 hours, sealing his fate with his own words. The silence that followed was deafening. Board members stared at Richard with expressions of disgust and betrayal, their trust shattered by the systematic nature of his crimes. Morrison's voice, when she finally spoke, was ice-cold and final. "Mr. Hartwell, you are terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and legal counsel will be notified of these findings. Your actions have violated every principle this company was built upon." But my revenge wasn't complete. I had one final revelation that would ensure Richard's destruction was absolute and irreversible. I pulled out a folder containing documents that Janet had provided, evidence of Richard's plan to expand his operation by recruiting additional accomplices within the company. "There's more," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. Mr. Hartwell was planning to build a network of corporate spies, using his position to compromise other employees and expand his betrayal to include classified government contracts. The folder contained lists of potential targets, employees who'd been identified as vulnerable to recruitment through financial pressure or career advancement. Richard's operation had been designed to grow, to transform from individual betrayal into organizational cancer that would have destroyed the company from within. The board's reaction was swift and unanimous. Richard would face criminal charges for espionage, his assets would be frozen pending investigation, and his access to corporate information would be revoked immediately. Security personnel appeared at the conference room door, their presence transforming Richard from executive to criminal in a single moment. As Richard was led away, his eyes met mine with a mixture of hatred and recognition. He finally understood that his termination of me hadn't eliminated a threat. It had created an enemy far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The quiet secretary he'd dismissed had become the architect of his destruction. The board meeting continued without him, but the focus had shifted from quarterly results to crisis management. Morrison assigned teams to assess the damage, notify affected clients, and coordinate with law enforcement. The company would survive, but it would take years to rebuild the trust and reputation that Richard had systematically destroyed. As the meeting concluded, Morrison approached me with an expression of grudging respect. She recognized the skill and determination required to build such a comprehensive case, the patience needed to gather evidence over months of careful surveillance. Her offer was immediate and generous, a senior position in corporate security with a salary that reflected my proven abilities. I accepted, not because I needed the job, but because it represented total victory over Richard's attempt to destroy me. He'd fired me for allegedly losing files, but I'd proven that I was exceptional at finding them. His betrayal had transformed me from secretary to investigator, from victim to victor. The news of Richard's arrest broke that evening, dominating local business coverage and sending shockwaves through the industry. The charges were extensive: corporate espionage, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit further crimes. His bail was set at $5 million, an amount that reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the flight risk he represented. But the legal consequences were only part of his punishment. Richard's reputation was destroyed, his career ended, his future prospects eliminated. The man who'd once commanded respect and wielded power had become a pariah, his name synonymous with betrayal and corporate corruption. My apartment felt different that night, transformed by the satisfaction of justice served. The recording device that had started my investigation sat on the kitchen table, no longer a tool of espionage, but a monument to patience and determination. Richard had underestimated me, and that mistake had cost him everything. The follow-up investigations revealed the true scope of Richard's operation. Victor was arrested in Prague, his network of corporate contacts exposed and dismantled. Other executives at competing companies faced charges for receiving stolen information, their careers destroyed by their association with Richard's crimes. The ripple effects spread through the industry, serving as a warning to anyone who might consider similar betrayals. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the recovery of stolen assets. Richard's offshore accounts contained over $15 million in payments from competitors, money that was returned to Hartwell Industries as partial compensation for the damage he'd caused. The company's stock price recovered, employee morale improved, and the culture of suspicion that had poisoned the workplace began to heal. Janet received immunity in exchange for her testimony, her cooperation proving crucial in unraveling the full extent of Richard's network. She'd been as much a victim as an accomplice, trapped by circumstances beyond her control and forced to choose between survival and integrity. Her relief at Richard's exposure was evident. The weight of complicity finally lifted from her shoulders. The trial, when it came, was a masterpiece of legal theater. Richard's defense team attempted to portray him as a victim of corporate pressure, a man driven to desperate measures by unrealistic performance expectations. But the evidence was overwhelming, the recordings undeniable, and the testimony from co-conspirators devastating. I testified for 3 hours, my presentation to the jury as methodical and comprehensive as my original investigation. Richard sat at the defense table, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of a man who'd lost everything. He'd aged years in months, his arrogance transformed into the desperate look of someone facing decades in prison. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Richard was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with additional fines and restitution payments that would ensure his financial ruin. The man who'd once fired me for allegedly losing files had lost his freedom, his reputation, and his future. As I left the courthouse, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me for months. The quiet secretary who'd been humiliated and terminated had become the architect of her oppressor's destruction. Richard's betrayal had awakened something in me that I'd never known existed, a capacity for patient, methodical, and absolutely devastating revenge. The sun was setting as I walked through the city streets, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to use the skills I'd discovered during my investigation. Richard had tried to destroy me, but he'd actually created something far more dangerous, a woman who understood that justice sometimes required taking matters into your own hands. The recording device that had started everything was now a memento, a reminder of the power of patience and the importance of documentation. Richard had taught me that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, that vigilance was the price of survival, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply letting someone destroy themselves with their own arrogance. In the end, I hadn't just exposed Richard's crimes, I'd proven that the secretary he'd dismissed as incompetent was actually the most dangerous person in his world. The files he'd accused me of losing had been found, and with them, the evidence that would ensure his destruction was complete and irreversible. The woman who'd once taken dictation and filed reports had become someone who took down corporate criminals and filed charges that would echo through the industry for years to come. Richard's betrayal had been my transformation, his downfall my resurrection, and his punishment my vindication. As I reached my apartment, I realized that my revenge was complete, not because Richard had been destroyed, but because I'd been reborn. The quiet secretary was gone, replaced by someone who understood that power came not from position, but from knowledge, not from authority, but from patience, and not from trust, but from the careful documentation of betrayal. Richard Hartwell had fired me for losing files, but in the end, I'd found something far more valuable: the strength to turn victims into victors, and the knowledge that justice, when properly served, was a dish best prepared with meticulous attention to detail and an unshakable commitment to the truth.